and welcome to another Pirkei Avot text explication video with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We are now on the 21st text in the 5th chapter, and this one, well, we're in for a ride on this one. This is a really interesting one, as we're about to see. Now, it starts off by saying, Hu haya omer, he used to say. And this is something I've mentioned before in the series. It's a formula that is basically expressing that the previous text, or whomever had spoken in the previous text, used this as a common and frequent expression in their life. Now, the previous text we had encountered was actually a couple of texts by Yehuda ben Tema. We have one where Yehuda ben Tema speaks, another where introduced by Hu haya omer, he used to say, and then we have this one. What's particularly curious is that in between, actually, there is an insertion. I mentioned at the end of the previous text discussion that there is a bit of a prayer that one asks that we have something, right? That God's city be built, as well as our portion being part of God's Torah. Now, this request, this supplication, seems to intercede between the two statements of Yehuda ben Tema's in the previous text and the text we have in front of us. Be that as it may, we're just going to roll along into the text we have in front of us, which is basically different stages of life at different ages of life. And this is Yehuda ben Tema's, which is Judah, son of Tama's, sort of breakdown of different, where people are at in their lives at different ages. Now, what's fascinating is, as we're about to see, actually, you know what? We'll have plenty of time to talk about breaking these down. So we're just going to roll into it. I'm going to read off everything, and then we'll start to break them down. Here we go. Ben Chamesh Shanim Lamikra, that boy of 5 years old, begins studying the scripture. Ben Eser LaMishnah, that a 10-year-old begins studying the Mishnah. Ben Shlosh Esrei LeMitzvot, a 13-year-old begins doing commandments. Ben Chamesh Esrei LeTalmud, a 15-year-old begins studying Talmud. Ben Shmona Esrei LeChuppah, an 18-year-old boy gets married. I'm going to pause here. I'm going to break in. There's something that's very deeply evident and just almost screaming out, shouting out, which is the language here. All of these begin with Ben, a son, which really highlights and indicates the highly gendered aspect of this text. All of these texts, I should say, really are not only spoken and articulated by specifically men, but the audience they had in front of them was also men. So when we think about this, the highly gendered aspect of this particular text really shouldn't surprise us, as we have had many texts that really come from a very sort of a man's perspective, as it were. The fancy term for this is androcentric. So the androcentricity of these texts comes out, but here, perhaps most evidently, as it is talking about the various stages of various ages in a man's life. One thing I want to encourage you to consider is, as we go through these, how does this compare, contrast to what we might expect of a woman's life at different stages and ages of her life? I just want to plant that seed and go back into this text. So now, so far, we have already 5 years old, 10 years old, 13 years old, 15 years old, and 18 years old. We already have 5 different ages and stages before even reaching the age of 20. Now, the subsequent 9 we are about to encounter are all different decades. And here we go. Ben Esrim Lirdof, a 20-year-old to pursue. It's vague, but we'll leave it there for now. Ben Shloshim Lekoach, a 30-year-old to power. Ben Arbaim Labina, a 40-year-old to discernment. Ben Chamishim La'etza, a 50-year-old to wisdom, or to advice, to advice, sorry. Ben Shishim Lazikna, a 60-year-old to old age. Ben Shivim Laseva, a 70-year-old to elderliness. Ben Shmonim Lagvura, an 80-year-old to strength. You didn't see that one coming. Ben Tishim Lasuach, a 90-year-old to be bent over. Ben Meya, a 100-year-old. Now this one is a bit of a curveball. Ben Meya Ki'ilu Meit, it is as if they are already dead. Va'avar vatel min haolam, and they have passed and already are nullified from this world. Woo! Wow, okay. That's a doozy, but we'll get there. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. I mentioned the highly androcentric nature of the all 14 of these different ages and the corresponding stages. And I want you to think about, first of all, I want you to think about how much does that match up with our own lived experience and our own contemporary cultural context, because this was stated nearly 2,000 years ago. Does this match up with our culture these days and various expectations of how people live their lives? That's one thing. And that's even just thinking about men. And then on top of that, I also want you to think about, what about women? How would women be similar, or how might they be different? Okay. Ben chamesh shanim lamikra. A 5-year-old began studying Scripture. Now, Scripture is not only the 5 books of the Torah, but it also includes the various books of the prophets and the writings, which include the book of Ruth, the book of Psalms. It's basically the foundational aspects of our culture. Our Jewish culture is our Jewish Bible. That is the foundation of our culture and heritage as a people. So 5 years old. And we have 5-year-olds who can begin reading in our day and age. Now, 10-year-old here begins studying what is known as the Mishnah. Now, the Mishnah, which literally, it actually is very similar to the word shin, like a secondary, right? Which is repeating. And what they used to do back in the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, well, the Mishnah itself was a huge publication. It was a huge body of text that was published around the turn of the beginning of the 3rd century. So we're talking around the year 200, maybe 210 of the Common Era. And this is a very foundational and very important foundational rabbinic text that has about various practices, many also concerning specifically the temple, about purity, about blessings, about many things in Jewish life. This is very important. But what's really fascinating about the publication of this vast, voluminous text is that it was published orally. It was not published to be written down. They did, of course, have, I just mentioned, the 5-year-old begins studying the Scripture. So those are all written texts. But the Mishnah is somewhat the foundation for what is known as the oral Torah, because it was transmitted orally, and people retained vast amounts of information, if you can believe that. Vast amounts of information all up in their head, and they spoke it, they heard it. It was the rabbinic culture was very, very into the oral transmission of these pieces of information and wisdom, which, if we just take a step back, it's unfathomable to us because we are so text dependent, so much writing, so much reading, but that was not the world in which they lived. But the 10-year-olds began studying this, which I mentioned. I would like to think of the Scripture as the foundation to Jewish culture, but the Mishnah is almost like the scaffolding of rabbinic culture, the sort of the foundational scaffolding. Okay, then we get to a 13-year-old, Ben Shalosh Esrei Lemitzvot, that a 13-year-old begins commandments, and this is what we call a bar mitzvah. Now, bar mitzvah literally means, bar is Aramaic for son, and mitzvah is Hebrew for commandment. So they are responsible for adhering to commandments, doing mitzvot. Now, the phrase bar mitzvah actually does not appear here. It does appear in the Talmud, I think only once, possibly twice, but it's not a common phrase within rabbinic or Talmudic literature. But that's where we get the sense of a bar mitzvah, that someone becomes responsible for adhering to basically what to do and what not to do according to the Torah. In 13, there's some responsibility, but I will point out here that it is not necessarily stating that this person becomes a man, or as we have in our culture, a 12-year-old becoming a bat mitzvah, right? A daughter of mitzvahs, a daughter of commandments. We're not saying, and certainly this text does not even intimate it, that they are entering into any sort of adulthood. In fact, it really just says that they are now responsible for these commandments, which I think is important when we consider bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs, They're not becoming a Jewish man or a Jewish woman. That's not what's going on. It's really an acknowledgement and a celebration that they are now entering into this special stage in their life or era, the next stage in which they are essentially responsible enough that they do what they're supposed to be doing. Okay, Ben Chamesh Esrei Talmud. Now, a 15-year-old began studying Talmud. Now, the Talmud is study of discussions largely surrounding the Mishnah, which we mentioned as a 10-year-old begins study of, and this is much more intricate. So whereas the Mishnah is more of essentially a scaffolding, this is more filling things in and discussion and endeavoring. And really, it takes another 5 years because you need higher mental and intellectual powers to be able to grasp and to wrestle with the various aspects of Jewish life. Okay, we're not even to 20 yet. Ben Shmona Esrei L'chuppah. 18-year-old goes to the chuppah. They get married. An 18-year-old gets married. Would that be? So this is a man already. And the question is, what about a woman? Would women get married even younger than that? I don't know. It's not clear from this text. But an 18-year-old is expected to get married already. An 18-year-old guy. Now we get to 20. Ben Esrim Lir Dof. A 20-year-old to pursue. It's really fascinating. What is this? Pursuing what? What is this 20-year-old now expected to pursue? It's not women, right? They're not pursuing a wife. They've already been married for 2 years. So what might this pursuit be? Well, it might be pursuit of livelihood. It might be pursuit of status in the world. Who knows what it is, but it's certainly something of. It's also interesting even thinking about the word because it's not necessarily achieving. It's just seeking and pursuing. So it's almost like pursuing a career, pursuing a livelihood, pursuing status in society. But, and I think this is really key, not achieving it. And I'm not saying that one shouldn't strive to achieve from this text. I'm saying that there's an expectation one begins their pursuit perhaps of a career, and yet it's not necessarily something one is expected to attain whilst one is in their 20s. Next up, now we're just going to go decade after decade. Ben Shloshim L'Koach, a 30-year-old to power. Now this is a text I've actually thought a lot about, but I haven't really found a lot that has been written about this. Really just a handful of descriptions. What does this mean? Energy, power. Koach here is power. It could be energy. It could be ability. Sometimes I've found translations of this as full strength. Okay, full strength. It's fascinating because that's not what it says. It could have used the word for full here, but it just says strength. So it could be literally physical strength, that it could be the height of one's physical strength. That is a possibility. I'm not going to downplay that. It's a possibility that one's full physical strength could be there. It could also, speaking of full strength, be one's full emotional strength, one's full intellectual or mental capacity strength. That could also be, it could be societal capacity or strength, or if we want to work with the translation of power, it's not just the intellectual powers or physical powers, but also societal powers. A man in their 20s does not have a lot of societal power, does not have a lot of social ability necessarily within a broader society, but they might command a little bit more respect while in their 30s. They're a little bit more socially powerful in that sense, or politically powerful, whereas one doesn't have that while in their 20s. So there are a lot of possibilities here to play with this translation because it is so incredibly terse. Koach. What is koach? What is ability? What is power? So those are some things to think about when a man is in their 30s. Next up, Ben Arbaim Labina, a 40-year-old to discernment. This has something, clearly this is very focused, whereas the last two, 20 to pursue and 30 for power, which were vague. But here it's very clear that someone has discernment, that someone might be smart, someone might have a lot of mental and intellectual capacity in their 20s and 30s, yet 40, this text points out, means that someone's achieving a certain a sense of figuring things out and mentally and intellectually discerning different things. Okay, so there's certain wisdom that accrues. And speaking of that, when we get to the next stage, Ben Chamishim La'etza, 50 years old, to counsel. That someone's not only basically wise, although what's fascinating is that wisdom is never mentioned in this text at all. Chachma is not mentioned. There are people who are described as chachamim, people who possess chachma, wisdom, and yet that's not necessarily something that comes with age, which is fascinating. Not everybody gets it. Some special people, it would seem, have that. But the person who has bina, the 40-year-old who has discernment, that's a certain sense of wisdom. And here, at 50, this eitzah of providing counsel, providing wisdom, that you've already achieved this 40-year-old status of having intellectual, perhaps even emotional discernment about things through time, and now you're able to not only think about things that way, but also to provide counsel and advice to other people seeking such wisdom and counsel. Ben Shishim La Zikna. Now this one is an interesting. 60 to old age. Now, Zikna is very similar to the word Zakein, which is a beard. So here, this 60-year-old has perhaps some sort of beard. And who knows, maybe this also has to do with, actually a question that arises with this is there a certain central sense of intellectual capacity here? I mean, we haven't discussed that recently. That doesn't come up here. But it seems like, I think there is a certain sense of bringing it all together here at age 60 that one does have as part of the zikna, as part of this old age, as it were. But it's also ascribing a certain sense of, or like being an elder. That one is able to use their discernment, one is able to use their counsel, and has elevated above all that and provide that to a broader culture and society in their wisdom. Okay, now we get to some interesting ones. Ben Shivim La Seva, a 70-year-old to Seva. Now, so I have two different things to say about this, both related to scriptural passages. Now, it seems to reference, why Seva? We don't really know what Seva. What exactly is this? Well, if we look at the first book of Chronicles, in chapter 29, verse 28, we have a phrase, B'Seva Tova, in reference to David, King David's, dying at age 70. And it refers to him as B'Seva Tova, a good old age. So, if King David died at the age of 70, B'Seva Tova, that was the state. So it sounds like even Yehuda ben Tema here is using that scriptural verse and saying someone, death can occur here at age 70. So someone just like with King David. And, but also fascinatingly, if we think about this and in tandem with the previous age of 60 of both Zakein and Seva, is that it's actually found in Leviticus chapter 19 of rising before an elder. It's Mipnei Seva Takum, Ufadarta, and then also, I'm forgetting the verse at the moment, but both of these terms are used in the exact same phrase, in the exact same verse in chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus. And they both seem to be synonyms for old age. And yet, what's fascinating, what Yehuda ben Tema does with those two phrases in that verse is to put them back to back at ages 60 and 70. Both putting them in, really, that juxtaposition provides a really interesting insight into what does this mean? How do we make sense of that? And so I'm fascinated by it. I'm going to bring this text up for you. It's too good of a verse to ignore that we have here, that you shall rise. Okay, it's verse 32 for those keeping score at home. Chapter 19, verse 32. Mipnei Seva Takum. You shall rise before the aged. V'hadarta Pnei Zakein. And you shall show deference to the old. Now, just for the fun of it, here's the end of the verse. V'yareta me'elohecha ani Adonai. And you shall fear your God, I am the Lord. Okay, so it has three parts, right? This third part is about fearing the Lord, but the first two parts are rising up in front of the aged and showing deference to the old. Now, I will say these first three words of this verse, just for the fun of it, Mipnei Seva Takum, rising before the aged, is actually, you can find it if you go to Israel. On the buses, they have these three words from chapter 19 Leviticus, Mipnei Seva Takum, to encourage people that if there aren't many seats available on buses, that people should get up and give their seat to someone who is perhaps more elderly. So, but these two expressions, Seva and Zakein, are both used here in chapter 19, verse 32 of Leviticus. And Yehuda ben Tema, taking them together, seems to, he uses that verse from Chronicles for the age of 70 and separating the two out. Now we get to Ben Shmonim, Lagvura, an 80-year-old to strength. Now, this is certainly strange. This is not what we would have expected. We just talked about two different other sort of synonyms for elderliness or old age. Now, why strength? Well, I think he's getting it from we've been doing a lot of biblical stuff in the older ages. It seems to be coming from the book of Psalms, chapter 90, verse 10, in which it says, V'im bigvurot shmonim shana, 80 years with strength. And so this seems to be indirectly referencing this verse from Psalms about strength at 80. This is not typically an age associated with physical strength. So I don't think that Yehuda ben Tema is just using it facetiously here. I think he is directly referencing this biblical verse. Okay, then we get to 90. Ben Tishim Lasuach, 90 years old, bent over. It's hard to keep one's back straight, and certainly not everybody has the straightest of backs when one gets up in age, 90 years old. It's definitely harder. And then we have this sort of curious, just sort of harsh description of Ben Mea Ki'ilu Meit Va'avar Vatal Min Ha'olam, that a 100-year-old is considered. Now, this is fascinating. Considered. What does that mean to be considered? But considered as if they are dead, as if they're dead and has passed beyond the world and gone. That is a very harsh statement. It's almost as if he is saying they might as well be dead. They're no longer of use to society. The society no longer has use of them. They're done for. They don't provide anything. But another way of perceiving it is it actually came from here. The insight came from my time here at Cedar Village. There was a resident. I'm not going to go into specifics, so you can't necessarily identify her, but it was fascinating to hear from her. I mean, this was her description, was that she said she's didn't really have a lot of hearing, didn't really have a lot of seeing left. So she couldn't really hear, couldn't really see, and she herself said she's done with this world. She's done. What does she have to live for? She had, grandkids. She had probably great-grandkids for all I knew. And she said, look, I'm done here. I'm done with this world. Why am I still alive? And ultimately, she did pass away. But that was so fascinating to hear it from her. It's one thing for others, outsiders, to talk about that. But for someone themselves to self-describe as saying, I'm done. I've lived a good life. I've run the course, as it were. It's sad. People want to live. We enjoy life. We celebrate life. But we can't ignore that death is also a part of life. And that's what Yehuda ben Tema seems to be finishing this whole entire saying, this statement off with, is saying, the truth is, you know what? Sometimes even those who are living are almost as if they are dead, which is sad. As a little bit of a coda, I just want to add that some of you might be thinking, why are you stopping with 100? Or more specifically, why is Yehuda ben Tema stopping with 100? What about 120? Don't we say Ad Mea Ve'esrim? Don't we usually say, as sort of a common expression of ours, may you live to be 120? right? That's an expression that people say. It's an expression that people use. Yehuda ben Tema, why don't you talk about 110? Yehuda ben Tema, why don't you talk about 120? And the truth is, I think that if I had to answer it for Yehuda ben Tema, I would suggest that he would say, once you pass that 100 mark, there's not really that much of a difference between 100, 110, and 120, which would be my guess. So, even that, the 120 thing is certainly an interesting discussion, and that certainly is something for another time. But these 14 different ages and corresponding stages of life, according to Yehuda ben Tema. Now, if we want to think about them, again, I want you to think, do we do these things? I would definitely say in contemporary society, it's very unusual for men to get married at the age of 18. Certainly Jewish men, even stranger still, maybe 25 to 40 are sort of the typical range these days. And, we have up to, up to the age of 15, between the ages of 5 and basically 15, there's a lot of more educational components to this. And then after that, it's various both societal, intellectual, and also physical developmental stages, which is an interesting thing to consider. Then 2 other layers, of course. One is, does this correspond and jive with the way that we understand the world that we're living in? This might have worked 18, 19 centuries ago, but does that correspond to ours? That's a good question. And then, of course, the other one is the very obvious gender question. Would this at all correspond? Does this correspond for women's various ages and stages of her life? And should it? I don't think this is the case. I mean, maybe marriage would be younger, perhaps. Maybe instead of being very scholastically oriented, it might have been different. Actually, 2 different questions. You have to ask, what might a corresponding gynocentric, right? This is androcentric, very men-focused, but maybe perhaps what was the corresponding? There might have very well have been something, could have been Yehuda ben Tema's sister or wife. Who knows? They could have come up with a corresponding sort of list of different ages and stages for a woman's life, and what might be expected, what might be valorized as what's to be done at different ages and stages. Who knows? Maybe also involved in, if we want to think about what that could be, it could involve beginning menstruation. It could be ending menstruation. It could be talking about children. So, and that's just the biological aspects, not even getting into the intellectual and various societal aspects of what that could entail. So, just, I know this was definitely the lengthiest in the series, definitely by far the longest. And so if you stay this far into this discussion, this text explication, this is certainly a lengthy one, definitely a long one. And I want to thank you for staying tuned and staying with it. And we're almost at the end of this chapter and towards the end of the project. But this one definitely, there's nothing going to be this long. But this was definitely the longest, and I hope this was insightful, and I'm happy to have conversations about this. This is certainly an interesting text and a very interesting statement by Yehuda ben Tema. So thank you so much for staying with us, and thank you so much for watching.